Today, we are finishing up a series that we have called This is Jesus. And what we've been doing is we've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and we've been trying to figure out who Jesus is. Because the truth is this: if I asked everybody in this room, who is Jesus, we would probably get a lot of different answers, right? If you Google who is Jesus, you get a lot of different answers. And so what we wanted to do in this series, what we've been doing as we've gone through the Gospel of Mark, is we've done our best to separate rumor from reality. We want to see who Jesus really, truly is. And so today, we're going to be in Mark chapter 14 for just a moment. If you don't have a Bible with you, that's no problem. We will have the verses up on the screen. But we're going to read about 6 verses, then we're going to pray, talk about it for a few minutes, and then we'll get you out of here to lunch, all right? How many of you guys are already hungry because I mentioned lunch? Yeah, there you go. I could eat whenever. I know it doesn't look like it, but I keep things pretty tight, but you know, I could eat sometimes, all right? All right, so Mark chapter 14, starting here in verse 3. This is about 2 days before Jesus is going to be arrested. So about 2 days before he is going to be killed, hung on a cross. And so it says this in Mark 14, starting in verse 3. It says, "Meanwhile, Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon, a man who had previously had leprosy." So this guy was a guy who had been healed by Jesus. Leprosy was a disease that would kill you slowly but surely. But while it killed you, according to Jewish customs, it would make you to where you could no longer be a part of society. You would have to announce everywhere you went that you were what they called unclean. And so no one wanted to be with you. Nobody could touch you. You could not have human physical touch, even have somebody shaking your hand. This would have been foreign to this man named Simon, but he had had leprosy, and Jesus had healed him. It says, while he was eating, he being Jesus, a woman came in with a beautiful alabaster jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard. So just so you understand, when they say this is beautiful perfume, best we can tell, this is probably perfume from like India, and this perfume would have been worth, in their day, about 300 days' wages. When we average that out, most people understand that to be about $20,000 worth of perfume in today's money. So she has this expensive perfume, and it says she broke open the jar and poured the perfume over his head. So in other words, she's not saving any for later. She's pouring it all out right then and there. And it says some of those at the table were indignant. They were ticked off. This bothered them. They said, "Why waste such expensive perfume?" they asked. "It could have been sold for a year's wages and the money given to the poor." So they scolded her harshly. Now, before you go agreeing with these men, here's what we understand from a similar account in the book of John, is that these men were not actually worried about the poor. These were the men who oversaw the money, and by the way, were stealing some money from the account that Jesus was building, right? So their concern is not the poor, their concern is themselves. It says, but verse 6, "But Jesus replied, 'Leave her alone. Why criticize her for doing such a good thing to me?' He says, 'You will always have the poor among you, and you can help them whenever you want to, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could and has anointed my body for burial ahead of time.'" And then this is the verse we really want to key in on today. It says in verse 9, "I tell you the truth, wherever the good news is preached throughout the world, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed." I want to talk to you just for about these next few minutes here about the idea of what you do. What you do. Because here's what I want you to understand. Why you do something matters, but what you do definitely matters. And so we want to talk for just a few minutes about what you do. So I'm going to pray for us, and we're going to jump right in, all right? God, I thank you so much for just being here with us today. God, for being among us, to where, God, when we're talking about you now, we're praying now, this isn't an empty exercise. This isn't something that we're doing and just throwing words out and hoping something happens. But God, we believe that you're true and that you are right when you say where 2 or 3 are gathered in your name, that you're there with them. God, we're trusting today that you're here with us and that you're going to change our lives. And so, God, I pray, honestly, with just a sense of anticipation that even now you're going to begin to speak to us. You're going to begin to show us where change needs to happen, and you're going to inspire us to walk out of here different than we came in. And we also trust that as the Indians kick off this week, that they're going to do very well. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Hey, pray for your sports teams, right? I prayed for the Cavs. They won a championship. So it happened once. It can happen again. Just not for the Browns. So they're pretty terrible, and I'm a Bengals fan. So I I have not been to a lot of concerts in my life. In fact, I just started going to concerts about a year and a half ago or so because Andrew, a guy who's back working with your kids right now, invited me to a couple. And it's kind of like a foreign experience to me. Like, I like music. I enjoy music. I like listening to music. I sing in my car like many of you do. And sometimes I forget that my window's rolled down, but the person next to me at the stoplight has not forgotten that fact. But I love music. But there was one concert I took my wife to just a few months ago. I took her to a Hanson concert. How many of you guys know who Hanson is? Hanson, right? Their famous song was made up, it's called MMMBop, okay? It's literally just random sounds that this band made. I thought they only had one song, so I thought the concert would go pretty quickly. Boy, was I wrong, okay? So we went up to the House of Blues in Cleveland. We're standing down on the floor, and I kid you not when I say, like, you don't have room to, like, even shuffle like this to get out of the way. You are just, like, belly to back, okay? At least me, belly to back with people, and it's uncomfortable, right? Like, it's just awkward. But the whole night, here's what happened, right? So the whole night, I know none of the songs, so I'm just kind of observing everything happening. And there's this one couple next to us, just over to the left, probably in their early 20s, and there's this girl who, if I can be honest, she was probably drinking a little too much, okay? Just especially for a girl her size, she's pretty little. And we got towards the end of the concert, and she had kind of been, very expressive the entire time. We get to this last song. I can't remember what the song was because I don't like Hanson. But it was kind of a slower song, and one of the Hanson boys, brothers, whatever they are, was singing and playing piano. And this girl, I kid you not, she's not crying. Okay, crying's okay. She's not crying. She is falling apart and sobbing like, oh my gosh, like collapsing into her boyfriend's arms. He's physically holding her up, like mascara is everywhere. I'm thinking this girl is gonna have to go to the hospital to get rehydrated. Like, she is losing her mind. And here's what I'll tell you. Every time I think about that Hanson concert now, besides the fact that there were way more guys there than I thought there were gonna be, what I will remember is this girl falling apart, right? Because here's the truth from it. Here's the truth about all this stuff. We all know this is true. When you get together with family, you all have stories about things that people have done, right? Like when I get together with the O'Connell side of the family, my wife's side of the family, especially at the holidays, we hear the same stories over and over and over and over again, right? And everyone laughs and everyone loves that stories. So a lot of times what happens is you are known for things, or you maybe have a nickname based on something that you did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Somebody in here, your nickname might still be Tiny, and you might be bigger than me, but it's because you were tiny a long time ago. See, here's the truth, and this is what we're going to spend the next few minutes unpacking together this morning, is that what you do outlasts you. What you do outlasts you. All right, so the things that you do, these are the things that people remember. Whether it's something you did as a child or something you did around your family that they just can't let go, or maybe something embarrassing that happened in a basketball game that you were playing in, or any number of things, what you do, both good and bad, outlasts you. If you don't believe me, think of the last funeral that you attended, right? How many times have you been to a funeral where somebody spends the entire eulogy talking about things that someone intended to do? It doesn't happen, right? When we break down their life, we talk about the things that they've done, because once again, what you do, both good and bad, outlasts you. So what you do matters. How you spend your life matters, because what you do outlasts you. And this is what Jesus commends about this woman in Mark chapter 14, right there in verse 9. He says, right, wherever people talk about my life, wherever people talk about what's happening right here, they're going to discuss this woman. They're going to talk about what she did. And guess what? Even if I'm the only person that's talked about it since then, 2,000 years later, it's true. People are still talking about what she did, because what you do outlasts you. And so here's what I want to do. I want to look at what she did, and my hope is that it informs for us what we should do. I want to look at what she did to see what should we do. And so 3 things I want to share with you. The first thing is this, is she did what she could. She did what she could. Notice what Jesus says there, the first part of Mark 14, verse 8. He says, she has done what she could. Did you ever notice, and fellas, you might agree with me on this, most of the time when I get in trouble, it's not what I said, but it's what?
How you said it.
How I said it, right? That's what I've been married almost 11 years. That's what I get in trouble for almost all the time. Not what I said, but how I said it. Because here's the truth. What you say most of the time isn't what really gets you in trouble, but it's how you say it. So notice the difference here. When it comes to doing what you could do, there's two different ways to say the same thing. What can I do? Right? That's kind of the sound of like resignation, like I have nothing to offer. Somebody asks for help, you're like, look, I don't even know what I can do. Like, what can I do about it? That to me tells me that you're not ready to step up. But here's the difference. Have you ever gone up to somebody when something bad happened? Maybe your car broke down or tragedy happened, which I think your car breaking down is tragedy, but maybe that's me. I have two old cars. But so you talk to somebody and say, hey, I need some help. And they say, what can I do? What can I do? You notice the difference there? Right, there's a huge difference between being resigned to thinking I have nothing to offer compared to thinking in this moment I have something to offer. And this woman in that moment, she had something to offer. Just days before Jesus would be arrested, she did what she could do. Now, I worked with kids for a long time. When I turned 19, I became a student pastor. So I was 19 pastoring kids who were 18, okay? Weird how that works. Probably shouldn't have happened. But I've worked with kids my entire adult life. And here's what I love about working with kids is they think they're smarter than you. Genuinely believe they're smarter than you, right? If you have a girl who just turned 13, this is where you might say amen. But, right? Exactly. They think they're smarter because here's what they'll do. They will do something wrong. Or can I just be bold enough to say they'll do something really stupid, okay? And they'll sit there and go, you know what? My parents, they're idiots. I can tell them whatever. They're going to fall for it. So what I would do is I wouldn't tell a kid that I knew they were wrong for at least 15, 20 minutes, okay? Brandon, back in the back, he would tell you this. There were times where I knew a kid had done something wrong. We had proof the kid had done something wrong. And I would talk them in circles forever. And I would let them indict themselves 10 different ways. And then finally, I would be able to look at them and say, do you think I'm dumb? And I would tell them how they did everything wrong. And I would tell them, if you had just been honest 30 minutes ago, this is a totally different conversation, right? Because here's the truth. When it comes to working with kids, and if you're in here and you're a student, I'm just going to let you know, okay? Because like I'm that dude who, when I was 18, had a party at my parents' house and thought I could convince them that the holes in the walls got there by complete accident and not because there was a party, okay? Adults can see right through you, okay? Here's what I'll tell you. When it comes to the excuses that we give God, he sees right through us. Because God's not man that he just sees what we do and go, oh, I wonder what's happening there. I wonder what's in their heart. I wonder what they're thinking. But no, the scriptures tell us that God weighs the heart, that God knows your mind. And so when we do things, including making excuses, God knows better. And so there's this story in the Old Testament, this account in the Old Testament of a prophet named Haggai. And for decades, for years, the Israelites, they were supposed to rebuild God's house, but for years had been making excuses. And so here's what it says in Haggai chapter 1, starting in verse 2. It says, this is what the Lord of heaven's army says. The people are saying, in other words, this is the excuse, and God's getting ready to tell them, I hear your excuse. The people are saying, the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. So this is what they've decided. This is what they've said. But then the Lord sent this message, verse 3, through the prophet Haggai. He's getting ready to call them out because, once again, he sees right through them. He says, why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? In other words, he's saying, you didn't just build yourself a home. God doesn't, he wants you to have a home. He wants you to be safe, right? That's fine. But he's saying, you've decided to not just build your home, but to make it luxurious. You've decided to really focus your time and attention on making things better for yourself. And then he's going to share with them, here's the results of your excuses. He says, look at what's happening to you. Verse 5. You have planted much, but harvest little. You eat, but are not satisfied. You drink, but are still thirsty. You put on clothes, but cannot keep warm. Your wages disappear as though you were putting them in pockets filled with holes. Here's what God tells his people then. Here's what God tells his people now. When you build your life on making excuses as to why you can't do the thing that God's asking you to do, number one, he sees right through you. And number two, no excuse is ever good enough. because you're going to work really hard at trying to make it look like you're working hard, right? You might work with people like that drive you nuts, and you wish God was still like Old Testament vengeful God, right? Here's the deal. God sees right through our excuses. He knows our hearts. He knows what we can do. And so the goal for us is not to do, the best according to somebody else. The goal is to do what we can do. This woman, she did what she could do, and it made a difference, which leads us to our second thing here, looking at what she did. Not only did she do what she could do, but she did what she could do while she could do it. She did what she could do while she could do it. Any college basketball fans in here? Like you've been loving March Madness. I love it. My son all of a sudden decided to love basketball. He calls it bat ball. And my wife tried turning the channel the other night. We were watching basketball. He cried until she turned it back. That's a parenting win, right? So I can watch basketball. She's outnumbered now. It's awesome. But here's what I really love about this time of year, especially in college basketball. If you lose, you're done. So when you step on that court, you've got 40 minutes of game time to either win in advance or lose and go home. There is an expiration clock on their time, on what they can do. For you and for me, here's what we have to understand. Our life matters. Every day counts because there is an expiration date on our obedience to God. There's an expiration date on our obedience to God. We can't just do whatever we want to whenever we want to do it and act like that's good enough, right? Like we talked about this morning with Scott and Melissa. Like we have certain things in our lives where we have a temporary, time-constrained amount to be obedient to God, right? You know how many times I've spoken to parents who their kids have been out of their home for 10 years, and what they share is regret at how they had raised their kids while they were in their home. Their life was so busy with everything else, right? Every single Sunday they were out playing sports, and I love sports, don't get me wrong, right? Love sports. They were out doing different things. They never made time to go to church, even consistently never made time to go to church. And then they wonder why their kid doesn't know Jesus, right? Because the time they had, they didn't do what they could have done when they could have done it, and now it's too late. See, for every single one of us, there is an expiration date on our obedience to God. We do not get to tell him when his work gets done. He tells us, Jesus even tells his disciples, they don't want to go from place to place, and he says, no, we must work while there's daylight. He's not saying we only work during the day, right? People came to Jesus at night. He's just saying, while the window of opportunity is here, we have to take it seriously. That's why I love so much Ephesians chapter 5, verse 16. Paul writes, make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Now, when he says evil, if you're in our church, you've heard this because this is one of my favorite verses. I share it a lot. He's not saying they're bad. He's saying the days are short. Right? He's saying that before you know it, your time will be up. Before you realize it, there's going to be an expiration date on your obedience to God. He says, make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Make the most of the time while you can. And see, for us, here's what we've done. We train ourselves at a young age to tell ourselves, I can do it later. Right? We train ourselves at a young age to think, I've got time to do this. I can remember being in high school and sitting at parties, and somebody would bring up every once in a while a religious question. And I can remember sitting there thinking, I'll worry about that later. I'll worry about that like once I get out of college, maybe I'll settle down, then I'll think about those things. But there's too much fun to be had right now. That's what I would tell myself. But that's ignorance at best. And realistically, it's just flat out negligence, and it's having a lack of understanding about life. My grandpa Johnson, when he was alive, every single time I would leave to see him, he had cancer for quite a few years before he finally passed away. And every single time I'd see him, because we lived hours away, I would say, hey, Grandpa, I'll see you soon, right? We'll be back soon. And he would always say, Lord willing, every single time. Because he had this understanding, like that with age came this wisdom, and age doesn't always come with wisdom, right? We know that. But with his age came wisdom. He understood, I don't know what tomorrow's going to be. Which is what James echoes here. He's the half-brother of Jesus in James chapter 4, verse 14. He says, how do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? How do you know? Can you even possibly know? Or are you just guessing? How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? He says, your life is like a morning fog. Another translation says, your life is like a mist or a vapor. It's here a little while, then it's gone. We have to push through the arrogance in our lives that tells us we have forever to do what we're supposed to do. There's an expiration date on our obedience. So we have to do what we can while we can do it. And then the last thing that she did that's so important, I think this is so great for us, is that she did what she could, not what someone else would. She did what she could, not what someone else would. Once again, we grow up comparing ourselves, right? At a young age, you learn how you look different from your friends and you compare yourself. You might take fashion risks because of that, right? There was one time, I definitely might have parted my hair right down the middle, worn a sweater vest and some khaki pants and thought I was cool. You guys can probably guess the result of that one. But we learn at a young age, right, how to compare ourselves, whether it's our looks or our grades or our friends or our home and the things that our parents can't afford and what our friends' parents can afford, right? Your kids will ask you for things not because you can get it for them, but because their friend has it, right? Like we just learn at an early age to compare ourselves. And so just to prove that to you, I've got a video here of my son and Brandon and Valerie's son, just to show you what I'm talking about. So my son's in front. This is really stretched. Brandon's son realizes that he's in back, compares himself, and then decides to cheat. I think at the very least what you could walk away with here today is understanding that in one home, there's humility, and in another, there's pride. Just throwing that out there. But here's the deal. We learned, here's the thing. You guys might think that's staged. This just happened organically like 2 weeks ago when Valerie was watching my son Brandon's wife. Your son won the race. The first shall be last is what Jesus tells us, right? So we learn how to compare ourselves from such an early age. Nobody has to tell us to do it. We just begin to notice, here's what they have, so here's what I should have. Here's what they've done, so here's what I should do. We compare ourselves over and over and over again. And here's the scary thing, is we allow what other people can do to create a ceiling and a floor for our obedience in life. We say, okay, well, I need to be at least as good as this person because then I can justify what I'm doing. So if everybody around me does this, then I'm willing to do that. But God forbid I go extreme and do anything above that, right? That might be like too weird and too religious. And then we look at other people and say, well, I don't have to be great. I just have to be better than that loser because they're like way down here, right? There's this thing called the lifeboat theory that when you get people, you put them in a lifeboat, automatically what people do is they begin to associate themselves to people they perceive to be as strong, just not maybe stronger than them, and they will disassociate from people who they believe are weak. This is why in your high school, when you go to high school, you will have a table that should seat 6, and there will be 12 crowded around it, and there will be another table with 2 or 3 kids sitting by themselves. And adults would walk in and say, why don't you spread out? You can still sit with your friends, just go to 2 different tables. And you'll say, no, that's okay. And you'll eat lunch on your lap because you don't want to be associated with weakness in your own decision, your own eyes. Right? We learn how to compare ourselves, but the idea is not to compare ourselves based on what somebody else has done, but the idea is to say, okay, my opponent when it comes to my obedience to God is me. I have to do more than what my flesh wants to do. I have to do what God's asked me to do. I've got to take the risk that God's asked me to take. I don't care what other people are doing. God, what have you asked me to do? Which is what Paul's talking about here in Galatians chapter 6, verse 4. He says, pay careful attention to your own work. For then, when you pay attention to your own work, your own life, your own self, for then you will get the satisfaction of a job well done. And you won't need, notice this, you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else. It won't even be necessary. You might still want to do it. You might still be tempted to do it, but it is not necessary because you are paying attention to your own life and what God has asked you to do. So what somebody else does or doesn't do doesn't matter. You're going to do what God's asked you to do. You won't need to compare yourself to anyone else. And then notice what he says here in verse 5. He says, for we are each responsible for our own conduct. Our own conduct. So what could you do? What right now is something that you can do? Like God's wired you a specific way. Right? And maybe, just maybe, you might see a problem in your family and you're thinking, I wish somebody would fix that. You might be the fix. Maybe you don't like the way people talk around your workplace and you just think, man, I wish somebody would just figure this thing out and start being positive. What could you do? Right? What could you do that you have a limited amount of time to do? Like for some of you, you're here. Your kids aren't. For some of you, you will run ragged to get your kids to everything else. Where are they at? For some of us, you know you've got a small amount of time to be obedient. God's given you a season in your life to maximize, and you're just waiting to run out the clock. That's not doing what you could do while you could do it. That's disobedience. You can't resign yourself to thinking something's over. And then what can you do regardless of what other people would do? Like, what can you do that would just keep you from comparing yourself to other people? Like next week, we're taking up this offering for Sarah, who most of you like, okay? We're taking up this offering to go towards this missionary work in Laos. And I'll be honest with you, Katie and I, we've prayed about how much we should give, and we're not rolling in the dough, but we have a number. And you know what? I'm not asking you how much you're giving, because I don't care. Because if you gave more, it's not going to make me feel bad. I've asked God what I'm supposed to do. And if you gave less, I'm not going to feel better than you. I might be better than you, but I'm not going to feel better than you. Right? Because we don't compare ourselves to other people. You are called to be obedient to God. You. And at the end of the day, here's what I really need you to understand. This isn't a scare tactic. This is just reality. And I would be unkind and unloving not to share it with you. One day, you are going to stand before God. And God's not going to ask you, did you make the most of every opportunity your parents gave you? God's not going to ask you if you did well compared to the person that you lived with, or if you did well compared to other people in your similar situation. He's not going to wonder what you did compared to somebody else, because at the end of the day, that's not what matters. What you do outlasts you, and what you do is what's going to matter one day when you stand before God. Now hear me, I'm not saying that you are saved because of what you've done. I'm just saying when Jesus changes your life, you will do good things as a response to him. So don't think you can do all the right things and then stand before God and go, well, I was a really good person. He's going to say, well, my translation of the Bible, I don't really care. It's not going to matter, right? What the Bible tells us is that our good deeds, they're garbage before God if they're done without him. So the goal for us, the goal for me, the goal for you, the idea, the conversation in my head that keeps me up thinking about my wife one day standing before God and my son one day standing before God, and all of you who are a part of this church and visiting this church, one day when you stand before God, here's what I would want to hear. It's Matthew 25:23. It's where the master looks at you and says, well done. Not well intentioned, not well thought of, right? Well done, my good and faithful servant. So the question for us is, what will you do?